Okay, Lego fans, I love y'all. I'm one of y'all, but we gotta sit down and talk about the state of Lego right now. All right, so this Lego Pokemon set got revealed, right? And I can't tell y'all how excited I've been for this line. I've been a Lego fan all of my life. Pretty much anytime I would get money as a kid, it would be saved up to go to Legos. Legos. I didn't even buy games. I never really had an Xbox until I was well into middle school. All my money went to Legos, and I became a fan of Pokemon about like a decade ago. And I think there's a lot of depth to it that people don't see. So I really love the franchise, but was really excited for the set. I think the sets look really really good. But then I saw the price tags, and I pointed out, hey, I think the price is too high for what you're actually getting in the set. And people immediately took issue with this because the price to part ratios were good for a lot of the sets. So I'm going to be breaking down the whole idea of the price to part ratio and why I think that it doesn't really hold up the way it used to back in the day. So first of all, if you're new to Lego, you might be asking what is this thing that people are talking about? Price to part ratio, price to piece ratio. What even is that? So price to part ratio is this idea. Well, it's a ratio. I mean, as it sounds, but it's this idea that ideally the way sets are priced in the 2000s era is you pay about $10 for every 100 pieces. So if you're paying $10 for a set, based on an ideal price to part ratio, you'd expect to have 100 pieces come in that set. And you see this consistently with a lot of sets, especially on the smaller scale. A lot of these battle packs, for instance, they'd be 100 pieces or 150 pieces and then be $10 to $15. And this was something that I actually noticed even as a child. I remember noticing it for the first time in like first grade. I would go through Lego.com, I'd look at all the sets that I want and like see, oh, do I have enough money saved up to actually get one of them? And I noticed that, hey, if I want this set that's $30, it usually has about 300 pieces, stuff like that. And I'd like to point out that this price to part ratio is based on convention. It has, at least to my knowledge, it doesn't really have much to do with how much. It doesn't have anything to do with like math about the supply chain or like how much it costs Lego to make the things. This is just what consumers see as custom. Just most of the time, if I'm paying $20 for a set, it's about 200 pieces. So, like I established, this is a conditioned standard just from the consumer's point of view. So, when Lego deviates from that, consumers do notice. Some common ways in which it deviates, for instance, is if it's a franchise theme. So, if it's not one of Lego's original themes, but something like Star Wars or a Disney product, Marvel, DC, DC not as much, but some of those other ones, if it's a big movie like Avatar or Pokemon, doing stuff with Nintendo, then you'd expect the price to be a little bit higher than that price to part ratio, but not by a crazy amount. It's also worth noting that the price to part ratio of each piece being about 10 cents, so $10 for 100 pieces, that doesn't really, well, that's not adjusting for inflation and things and how things have shaped up with time. So that price to part ratio, like I said, I noticed it when I was in first grade. That was back in 2011. So the price to part ratio was very relevant then at that $10 to 100 pieces. Nowadays, it's a little bit more expensive. So an indicator of this are the Star Wars battle packs. I don't know if there are $15 battle packs anymore. I think they might all be $20. They're either between 15 and 20, when back in the day, they used to be 10 and maybe 15 if they had some extra stuff in it. So price to part ratio is just the standard that the consumer is used to. When things really get out of the price to part ratio, consumers really notice, and it immediately can be a turnoff unless there's a real good reason for the price to part ratio to be so off. A great example of this that came out last year was the 2025 Turbo Tank. This set, I think, represents like everything that people complain about modern Lego. It was so expensive. That whole Star Wars line was very expensive for what it was, for the amount of pieces that you get, and especially compared to the previous versions of the sets that had come out like 10 years ago. But the Turbo Tank in particular, man, that thing was so expensive. It wasn't structurally sound. It was just a really not good set. It was smaller than all the previous Turbo Tanks, and it's just so expensive, so expensive. Sometimes sets are going to be more expensive, like wildly so, if they have like an electric motor or a battery box, things like that. And a lot of times that ends up being okay for customers. because hey, that adds a lot of value to the set. I'm gonna get back to using that term later, but that adds a lot of play value and just value in general. So you look at a lot of these Technic sets. Honestly, they do pretty good about the price to part ratio, but sometimes they can be more on the expensive side because they have some of these electric elements, and a lot of times people are okay with that. But for the most part, if something is wildly out of the price to part ratio on the high side, and there's not a very good reason for it to be so, consumers are immediately going to be like, hey, this is not good value for the set. Where I think a lot of y'all have been like conditioned and fall into this trap is even if a set has a good price to part ratio, that does not mean that it's a good value for the set. That does not mean that. The price to part ratio is a metric that can be used to try and measure a set's value, but price to part ratio is not the value of the set, is not the value the set has to the consumer. That's a different thing. And I think y'all have been conditioned to not see that anymore. So I'm gonna go back to this Pokemon set real quick. My problem with it is the problem that I pointed out is it is just so expensive for what it is. It is so expensive for what it is. I think it looks very good, but it's expensive for the value that it gives the consumer, I would say. It's good in terms of the price to part ratio, but not in terms of what that price to part ratio does for the consumer. So if we look at the set, it's the 3 starter Pokemon from Kanto. You got Charizard, Blastoise, and Venusaur, and they look extremely nice. And then they have this extremely nice looking, ornate, well detailed base. But the main feature of the set are the 3 Pokemon. It's not the base. So most of the value is in the Pokemon themselves, and the base is not adding much more value than looking nice and just holding up the thing. And you could just have a much more basic base and still have most of the value in the set, but the cost would go much, much lower. So even though you're lowering the value of the set just slightly because it looks slightly less cool, the price is going down a lot more than that. So now your price to consumer value ratio has now gone up, if that makes sense. You're getting more for what you're paying for. And again, I mean more in terms of customer satisfaction, not more in just raw piece count. Because if the base itself, within itself, was adding a lot of value for the set, why doesn't Lego just make sets that are just bases? Like, imagine the Pokemon set, but without the Pokemon, and it's just the base. Would you all pay, what, $200 for that? Hey, it has 2,000 pieces, right? But even though that price to part ratio might be good, it's not adding the customer value that people are looking for. Another example that I think will be a lot less divisive is the Smart Brick. The Smart Brick, right, is this super high-tech brick that Lego is rolling out. It has accelerometers, LEDs, all these different sensors in it, and it makes noise. It has speakers in it. Really cool engineering-wise, but fans are not very excited for it. It kind of takes away the imagination that you're supposed to have with Lego, and it really drives up the price. And for the amount of money that Lego is demanding for this thing, it needs to do a lot more. Like even the Star Wars interactions it has, they're not like it doesn't use actual Star Wars sound effects, for instance. Things like that. It's just it drives up the set cost by close to $50. Like you're paying almost $50. It feels like just for that brick, and people are not with it. And that's compared to some of the Technic sets that I mentioned, right? Where they also have their price driven up, but those add a lot more value to the consumer, to the set, and therefore you don't see a lot of consumers complaining about it. Even though some of those Technic sets, like the big excavator one or like the industrial mining one, super expensive, but the consumer value is there, so people are willing to pay for it, if that makes sense. So this is all just to say that you shouldn't blindly just use price to part ratio to excuse every single set and think that, hey, Lego deserves my money. Just because Lego maintains the price to part ratio does not mean they're entitled to your money. Like, you need to still be able to think about, hey, does this set actually, is this going to give me the satisfaction that I'm looking for the amount of money that I'm giving Lego? You're not just paying for pieces. Like, you're paying for the whole experience. And even if the piece count to price is good, if you're not getting the experience you feel like you should be for the price, then it might not be a good set. At least in that specific regard. The set itself can be really good. The Pokemon set, the set itself, if I never saw the price, and even having seen the price, the set itself is amazing. It's just the price that I have an issue with. And a lot of people will bring up the Ultimate Collector Series sets, for instance, as being in a similar boat. But part of the customer satisfaction of the UCS models and the big Avengers Tower is the size itself, is that it's big. So that is a reason people are paying the money. For the Pokemon sets, it's not the people didn't ask for it to be big. They were excited about the Pokemon itself. That's why, like, if you look at the Mega Bloks versions, for instance, I think those would have had a lot more customer satisfaction for the price point that they're at, uh, because you're still getting the Pokemon, but you're not paying so much for the base, and you're not paying so much to have them all in one set. You can kind of pick and choose which ones you want and not have to pay out this huge amount of money all at one time. So those are my thoughts, especially in 2026, especially as a student that doesn't have just an infinite income, how I feel about things. But let me know what y'all think in the comments. Just be nice. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.